have that going on. But on the other hand, you have, as the book also shows, you have a growing mass export trade in slaves, which is fundamentally built on dehumanization, and increasingly an equation of humanity as mercancia, as produce.
But also, too, that in order to do that, these have to be inferior beings.
Exactly, and as the scholar David Bryan Davis has shown, traditionally racism has often been assimilated to animalisation. And one of the very interesting things is that the very first item which was traded for slaves in Africa were horses, and that in fact there's a scholar called Trevor Hall who's shown that the very ships which took horses to Africa were the ships which then took slaves back to Cape Verde. So at the very earliest trade, you have the beginnings of an incipient animalisation. And I think that's very important, and it shows how, as I say, you have multiple things happening at once. You don't have a holistic ideology. And when we look at it from today's perspective, there's often a tendency to try and think, well, how did this progress? But progress is often happening in a
straight line.
Not in a straight line, that's right.
And you argue that these kinds of changes that you're talking about that happened to African society were not just imposed from outside by Europeans, but were also the result of what you describe as internal dynamics. What's the evidence for that?
Well, there's a huge amount of evidence for that. I mean, fundamentally, this is talking about African agency. And so I think one of the things we need to get away from, and it's very difficult talking about the subject of slavery in the Atlantic world. I mean, on the one hand, it's clearly true that African societies, and this is the element of internal dynamics that you were talking about, are not just passive victims. They're not. It's not a case. I mean, when I teach the subject, I've sometimes and quite often had students saying, they assumed that it was simply a case of Europeans arriving and seizing slaves, and that of course brings with it this sense of the passivity of the subject of African subjects in an imperial context, which is one of the things which grew out of the history of modern European empires. Now, clearly, when you actually look at the sources, that's not the reality. So, for example, these mixed communities living in Guinea-Bissau, there's quite a lot of evidence to show that, for example, when the king of the region where the main trading port is wanted to achieve something, he simply got his people to occupy the water source for 3 days, and the Luso-African traders, and the European ships coming just simply had to do what the king wanted. So, in that sense, what the book shows is how African political and social dynamics responded to external pressures, but at the same time they did so in a positive, creative way, and that actually the way in which they did so was fundamentally shaping what are modern identities in West Africa, and that's a very important point. At the same time, and I think one of the things which the book shows is that the external influence created cycles of violence and cycles of destabilisation, which were also very important in shaping those identities. So, in fact, there's a very interesting recent book by a Nigerian scholar, Mokeji, who talks about the dynamics between external and internal agencies. And I think in some way that's what I'm trying to talk about in the book.
And in a way, what was created was a self-reinforcing cycle of disorder brought about by the slave trade. So you had war between Africans that created slave captives, that created wealth, that allowed them to buy the horses, for example, that we were talking about earlier. In a way, it's almost what Walter Rodney was arguing in How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. So
yes, I mean, I think that's in many ways right. And I think that the Rodney comparison. I mean, Rodney, famous as he became as an activist in the 70s, his original work was actually on this very subject, on the history of Upper Guinea from the 16th and 19th centuries. I think where I would differ from Rodney is thinking about the ideas of war. I mean, Rodney and others at the time had very much like this idea of the predatory state, the predatory African state, and for Rodney and people writing that time...
Well, the ideas were essentially Marxist, and
the ideas were Marxist.
War came with capitalism.
War came with capitalism, indeed. But in the specific case of this region, Rodney, for example, talked about Gabu, the empire of Gabu and its predatory wars. And what, the last 10 years has shown that the story is a little more nuanced than that. There were, so for example, raids often were much more localised. The idea of war and standing armies perhaps isn't necessarily accurate for this region, partly because of the geography, but also partly because, so for example, among the Balanta people, there was a long tradition of cattle raids being very important as a rite of passage for young men, and the ability to buy cattle. Now, with the advent of the slave trade, the ability to buy cattle became tied up with participation in the slave trade. So often the way you would buy cattle would be by slave raiding to the nearby village. So it's not exactly war. I think so. War is perhaps not quite the right. There is an aspect of war, but it was also related to cultural identities and how they've grown up and how the Atlantic slave trade themselves has affected the way in which people can participate in those.
Slavery has clearly left a deep mark on the psyche of these societies where slaves come from. How is it remembered through oral history and witchcraft practices?
That's a great question. I mean, and a lot of people give you very different answers. I mean, I think the best way to answer that is through anecdotes in some ways. So, for example, I remember travelling in Guinea-Conakry 10 years or so ago, and in quite a remote area, going from one village to the next village, and the person I was with turning to me and saying that the person from the other village says, these people have always been our slaves. So that story sort of implies a deep-seated memory of slavery and hierarchical relations between villages. One of the very interesting things that Rodney actually showed in an article from the 70s is that, and in relating particularly to Guinea-Conakry actually, that in the 18th century, those ideas, the sources show us, didn't really exist before the 18th century, and then there was a mass expansion of slaving in the 18th century in that region, and that would tend to imply that this kind of hierarchical relationship developed after that. So clearly there is a relationship. Other scholars have argued recently that it might be remembered through practices of, for example, performative dances and rituals such as elements related to rituals such as circumcision. I refer to some of that in the book. I think and there is of course a whole range of scholarship on the relationship between witchcraft and slavery, and the relationship between witchcraft and cannibalism I think is also very important. The memory of the idea that a witch is literally somebody who eats people, and the relationship between that and the idea that a lot of different African peoples, from Senegambia right down to Angola, saw Europeans as cannibals because they were literally eating people. It's an extremely complicated subject. I would say that Africans remember it today more through those types of narrative than through what we would think of as a traditional historical narrative. So one of the very interesting things in Gabu, for instance, is that there's a lot of oral history on the formative period of Gabu from the 14th to the 16th centuries, and a lot of oral history on the decline of Gabu in the late 18th and 19th centuries, but there's very little in between, which is of course the period of the Transatlantic Slave Trade.
So that is the missing period, as it were.
In a lot of oral history narratives, that is the missing period.
Toby, thanks for talking to me today.
Okay, thank you, Russell.